Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 218, Reconstruction, Part 2. Last week, we were able to run down at least part of Reconstruction, including Lincoln's thoughts, and also talking about Andrew Johnson. This week, we will continue through the 1860s, moving into 1870s, and eventual conclusion of the period, although there are going to be continuing fallouts past then. Before we do that, though, of course, we do need to talk about our Patreon content, and recently we posted a movie review. That one's going to be Major Dundee, and I think actually the depiction of the time period within the movie is late 64 into early 1865, so it goes very nicely here with our own conclusion here of the main narrative episodes. So if you want to hear me talk a little bit about the historical accuracy of that film and the parts I liked and didn't like, that is posted in the Patreon feed, and we have some other items as well, memoir reviews, picture slideshows as well. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. So remember that Andrew Johnson had been removed as the primary policy owner for Reconstruction following his impeachment. Instead, it would be Congress who would decide the course moving forward. Remember that Johnson had shown less cooperation for the acts and amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, the 14th gave citizenship to the formerly enslaved, and the 15th would remove barriers to vote. But barriers there were. Barriers would come in the form of white Southerners who refused to conform to the radical Republican way of thinking. Indeed, while many in the South did not necessarily wish to move back to secession or slavery, they were also not good with equality, still holding on to white supremacy. White supremacy, remember, had been a key tool for the Southern society prior to the Civil War. While it really was the wrench-planting elite making the most money, poorer whites who supported the structure could still cling to that notion, content seemingly in their subpar place compared to the rich. President Johnson's support of state officials, both former Confederates and former Southern aristocracy, so to speak, would lead to continual issues. Many states would wish to reject the new amendments and would in the process create their own black codes, as we mentioned last episode. Congress would realize that there would be a need for harsher measures, especially when compared to the violence that had started to pop up. We have a report from the Freedmen's Bureau on one such occasion in Memphis. On the evening of the 30th April, 1866, several policemen came down Causey Street and, meeting a number of Negroes, forced themselves off the sidewalk. In doing so, a Negro fell and a policeman stumbled over him. The police then drew their revolvers and attacked the Negroes, beating them with their pistols. Both parties were then separated, deferring the settlement by mutual consent to some future time. On the following day, May 1st, during the afternoon, between the hours of 3 and 5, a crowd of colored men, principally discharged soldiers, many of whom were more or less intoxicated, were assembled on South Street in South Memphis. 3 or 4 of these were very noisy and boisterous. 6 policemen appeared on South Street. 2 of them arrested 2 of the Negroes and conducted them from the ground. The others remained behind to keep track of the crowd, when the attempt was made by several Negroes to rescue their comrades. The police fell back when a promiscuous fight was indulged in by both parties. During this fray, one police officer was wounded in the finger, another, Stevens, was shot by the accidental discharge of his pistol in his own hand, and afterward died. About this time, police fired upon unoffending Negroes remote from the riotous quarter. Colored soldiers with whom the police first had trouble had returned in the meantime to Fort Pickering. The police was soon reinforced and commenced firing on the colored people, men, women, and children, in that locality, killing and wounding several. Shortly after, the city recorder, John C. Crichton, arrived upon the ground, corner of Causey and Vance Streets, and in a speech, which received 3 hearty cheers from the crowd there assembled, counseled and urged the whites to arm and kill every Negro and drive the last one from the city. Then, during this night, the Negroes were hunted down by police, firemen, and other white citizens, shot, assaulted, robbed, and in many instances, their houses searched under the pretense of hunting for concealed arms, plundered, and then set on fire, during which no resistance, so far as we learn, was offered by the Negroes. A white man by the name of Dunn, a fireman, was shot and killed by another white man through mistake. During the morning of the second incident, everything was perfectly quiet in the district of disturbance of the previous day. A very few Negroes were in the streets, and none of them appeared with arms, or in any way excited except through fear. About 11 o'clock a.m., a posse of police and citizens again appeared in South Memphis and commenced an indiscriminate attack upon the Negroes. They were shot down without mercy. Women suffered alike with the men, and in several instances little children were killed by these miscreants. During this day and night, with various intervals of quiet, the nuisance continued. The city seemed to be under the control of a lawless mob during this and the 2 succeeding days, 3rd and 4th. All crimes imaginable were committed, from simple larceny to rape and murder. Several women and children were shot in bed. One woman, Rachel Johnson, was shot and then thrown into the flames of a burning house and consumed. Another was forced twice through the flames and finally escaped. In some instances, houses were fired, and armed men guarded them to prevent the escape of those inside. A number of men whose loyalty is undoubted, long residents of Memphis, who depreciated the riot during its progress, were denominated Yankees and abolitionists, and were informed in language more empathetic than gentlemanly that their presence here was unnecessary. To particularize further as to individual acts of inhumanity would extend the report too great a length, but attention is respectfully called for further instances to affidavits accompanying marked. The riot lasted until and including the 4th of May, but during all this time, the disturbances were not continual, as there were different times of greater or less length in the day in which the city was perfectly quiet, attacks occurring generally or after sunset each day. The rioters caused their violence either of their own accord or from want of material to work on, the Negroes having hid themselves, many fleeing into the country. So we have this account. This happened in Memphis, but there's actually other accounts throughout the South of very similar events that are happening, right? And the problems that are causing these are multiple, right? I think that there is a heavy emphasis here on the fact that, both sides are feeling some tension and then things start to pop off, right? I think there's still, obviously, a feeling of there being some kind of enslaved insurrection, right? That's definitely something that we've talked about before, and that Southern culture is really terrified of these kinds of slave revolts that could possibly pop up. And really, there's only a couple in American history. And specifically, we've talked before in several memoirs how people have talked about how they mentioned Haiti, and how Haiti obviously is not on diplomatic relations with the United States because of that, because they are really the only successful slave revolt in history, and they've created their own nation as a result of that. Well, that's something that really terrifies the southern United States, obviously, and they're pretty close, considering geography, they're fairly close to where Haiti is, so they don't want anything like that to be spreading to them. We talked recently in some of our world events about Jamaica and how they're also experiencing similar problems. While it's not a culture that is still having bondage, human bondage, it does have this kind of inequality between races, and you're also having this kind of issue of rights and voting and what happens now, and there's just a whole lot of tension there that's building up. Like I said, there's several other instances that we could have talked about. This is just one example to give you an idea of what's happening throughout the South during this period and why it's such a problem, because Andrew Johnson is placating a lot of the individuals in the South. Remember, we talked about that last episode, how he's from Tennessee, and he's just trying to kind of give this olive branch to the Southern elites, a lot of whom had either been in part of the Confederate government or they had been in the Confederate Army, and they're regaining their political power here in these places. So in a lot of ways, while I mentioned there, it's not entirely going back to the status quo, there is still something of what it was pre-Civil War. So you have again, those same feelings, and they're going to act, relatively in the same way. Supposedly here, in these cases, they're acting without any kind of fear of punishment, even though very rightly they should be punished, right? And certainly under the new laws that have been passed, they would be punished. But I think another great example of this happening does occur in New Orleans, and we kind of talked about this a little bit in our mentionings of James Longstreet. Well, James Longstreet is actually going to help to kind of put down these riots, and he's going to defend, in this case, formerly enslaved individuals, and that's going to gain him the ire of individuals like Jubal Early, who is going to then write about how he was a terrible general during the war, right? The lost cause narrative is kind of linked into Longstreet, who's trying to really conform into this new society, and he's trying to support the Republican regime, right? And then he's going to draw the backlash of individuals like Early, who are they going to talk about how he's the reason why you lost Gettysburg and this, that, and the other. So you have these instances that are happening immediately after the war, and they have ramifications for, even in this case, how we view history. Military districts would be established with 20,000 troops deployed across the South. Schofield would take Virginia, Sickles the Carolinas, Pope and Meade, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Arkansas, and Mississippi under O.C. Ord, and Texas and Louisiana under Sheridan and Hancock. Not only a good amount of troops, but also a good amount of capable officers to quell any unrest. This would be to combat the states that had not fully integrated back into the Union. The state of martial law would help to keep order. State conventions would start to take over in the southern states in the meantime. The election of 1868 would see Ulysses S. Grant take the Republican nomination. Grant would run against Horatio Seymour of New York, with Franklin Preston Blair being the Democratic vice president. His own vice president would be Schuyler Colfax, a former Whig and a descendant of the cousin of Philip Schuyler, who you might remember as Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law. The ticket would win the popular vote and rack up 214 electoral votes. In his inaugural address, Bliss would state, "The country, having just emerged from a great rebellion, many questions will come before the settlement in the next 4 years, which preceding administrations have never had to deal with. In meeting these, it is desirable that they should be approached calmly, without prejudice, hate, or sectional pride, remembering that the greatest good to the greatest number is the object to be attained. This requires security of person, property, and free religious and political opinion in every part of our common country, without regard to local prejudice. All laws to be secure these ends will receive my best efforts for their enforcement." So if you read between the lines there, we can take 2 points from Ulysses Grant and his inauguration and his address, and that is that, number one, he is talking about how there needs to be freedom and justice for everybody, right? Everyone needs to be able to feel that, including the individuals who have just recently received citizenship, right? Your formerly enslaved population. So you have him talking about that. Everybody has to be kind of together. There's a common cause here. Everybody's part of the country now, right? Then you also have another interesting point that I like to point out is that he is talking about how we've never had to deal with this before, right? And it's something that I brought up when I talked about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln has never had to deal with, no president has ever had to deal with this American Civil War where he's going to have these extra powers. He's never going to have a situation where he's had to deal with it, or at least nobody else has. So he's going through everything the first time. So that's another reason why I think we take a look at these things and we're like, whatever, sure, they should have known what to do, right? But in these cases, this is the first time they've never had to deal with it. So I think it's another point that we can make where these individuals are actually humans and they're not just names that you read off a paper and maybe in a history book. Elihu Washburn, who had been Grant's political benefactor, would originally be placed as Secretary of State before resigning. Hamilton Fish of New York would replace him. The Secretary of War would go to his former Chief of Staff, John Rawlins, but he too would need to be replaced after dying of tuberculosis, William Belknap taking his spot. You might remember Belknap from serving in the Western Theater, originally from an Iowa regiment. Now, Grant had campaigned on the Republican ticket to allow African Americans their rights, which meant that a lot of the white vote did not go his way. However, he would receive a larger support from the black population. There's also something in me that you point out with Grant where this is McClellan as he should have been, right? Like in the 1864 election, everyone's like, oh, well, McClellan's obviously going to win because he's so popular, whereas now you actually have a general with certified wins under his belt and is also, partially loved by his troops, so you definitely have him taking his place. Remember that Grant in the South had been a great liberator. He had tried to set up the formerly enslaved as support systems for his armies as they campaigned, obviously giving them much better situations than to be on a plantation. Grant would sign a Naturalization Act in 1870 that would place controls for naturalizing citizens. This act would be more geared toward African Americans than other races. Additionally, Grant would ratify the 15th Amendment against the disenfranchisement of African Americans. Several states would be admitted back into the Union on his watch, including Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas. A problem that would be first and foremost in the mind of Grant would be the elimination of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, we have mentioned before about the creation of the KKK, but it should be noted that in these early stages, it was a slightly different organization. While still based in radical inequality, it would also be seeking to protect the interests of Southerners against Republicans and Northerners wishing to profit off the South. Obviously, this would include violence against blacks and also Republicans. As a result, Grant would create a Justice Department that would specifically combat this organization. The efforts of this Justice Department with the Attorney General, Amos Ackerman, would indict several thousand and have 600 convictions. Most notably, these efforts were carried out in South Carolina. Hiram Ridley would become the director of the new Secret Service agency, which would operate against the Klan as well. Enforcement acts would be passed in the 1870s to aid in this effort. This would allow for the protection of the freedmen's right to vote, serve on juries, and get some equal protection under the laws. Martial law would be suspended, as it had during the Civil War, and suspending the writ of habeas corpus. The Amnesty Act of 1870 would be passed to restore rights to former Confederates, with the exception of a few. We will talk a little bit about the overall presidency of Grant when we get into his analysis in a future episode, though. We have a little on Grant's goals for Reconstruction here, though, by reading a good section of his second inaugural address. Under our republic, we support an army less than that of any European power of any standing, and a navy less than that of either of at least 5 of them. There could be no extension of territory on the continent which would call for an increase of this force, but rather might such extension enable us to diminish it. The theory of government changes with general progress. Now that the telegraph is made available for communicating, though, together with rapid transit by steam, all parts of a continent are made contiguous for all purposes of the government, and communication between the extreme limits of the country made easier than it was throughout the old 13 states at the beginning of our national existence. The effects of the late civil strife have been to free the slave and make him a citizen, yet he is not possessed of the civil rights which citizenship should carry with it. This is wrong, and should be corrected. To this correction I stand committed, so far as executive influence can avail. Social equality is not a subject to be legislated upon, nor shall I ask that anything be done to advance the social status of the colored man, except to give him a fair chance to develop what there is good in him. Give him access to the schools, and when he travels, let him feel assured that his conduct will regulate the treatment and fare he will receive. The states lately at war with the general government are now happily rehabilitated, and no executive control is exercised in any one of them that would not be exercised in any other state under like circumstances. In the first year of the past administration, the proposition came up for the admission of Santo Domingo as a territory of the Union. It was not a question of my seeking, but was a proposition from the people of Santo Domingo which I entertained. I believe now, as I did then, that it was for the best interest of this country, for the people of Santo Domingo and all concerned, that the proposition shall be received favorably. It was, however, rejected constitutionally, and therefore the subject was never brought up again. In future, While I hold my present office, the subject of acquisition of territory must have the support of the people before I will recommend any proposition looking to such acquisition. I say here, however, do I not share in the apprehension held by many as to the danger of the governments becoming weak and destroyed by reason of their extension of territory. Commerce, education, and rapid transit of thought and matter by telegraph and steam have changed all of this. Rather, do I believe that our great Maker is preparing the world, in his own good time, to become one nation, speaking one language, and armies and navies will be no longer required. My efforts in the future will be directed to the restoration of good feeling between the different sections of our common country, to the restoration of our currency to a fixed value as compared with the world's standard of values, gold, and if possible, to power with it, to the construction of cheap routes of transit throughout the land, to the end that the products of all may find a market and leave a living remuneration to the producer, to the maintenance of friendly relations with all our neighbors and with distant nations, to the reestablishment of our commerce and share in the carrying trade upon the ocean, to the encouragement of such manufacturing industries as can be economically pursued in this country, to the end that the exports of home products and industries may pay for our imports, the only sure method of returning to and permanently maintaining a specie basis, to the elevation of labor, and by a main course to bring the aborigines of the country under the benign influences of education and civilization. It is either this or war of extermination. Wars of extermination, engaged in by people pursuing commerce and all industrial pursuits, are expensive, even against the weakest people, and are demoralizing and wicked. Our superiority of strength and advantages of civilization should make us lenient toward the Indian. The wrong inflicted upon him should be taken into account and the balance placed to his credit. The moral view of the question should be considered, and by the question asked, cannot the Indian be made a useful and productive member of society by proper teaching and treatment? If the effort is made in good faith, we will stand better before the civilized nations of earth, and in our own conscience for having made it. All these things are not to be accomplished by one individual, but they will receive my support and such recommendations to Congress as will, in my judgment, best serve to carry them into effect. I beg your support and encouragement. It has been, and is my earnest desire to correct abuses that have grown up in the civil service of the country. To secure this reformation, rules, regulations, methods of appointment, and promotions were established and have been tried. My efforts for such reformation shall be continued to the best of my judgment. The spirit of the rules adopted will be maintained. So here we go. We have some things here for the second inaugural address for Ulysses S. Grant. And we kind of get the gist here. We have a good understanding of how there needs to be an emphasis on getting the country back on track, right? We need to be able to not have such a large army. We don't really need it. I think it is actually interesting to kind of look at Ulysses S. Grant as the first president where expansion is really not predicated on whether it's going to be a free or a slave state, right? I think that's something that we talked about in our Setting the Table episodes and something we really emphasized in the earlier parts of the country where, you know, hey, we need to get Cuba on board because we need to make that a state and it's going to be a slave state. And then that way we can still continue to expand more westward and create some northern states, right? And then we have popular sovereignty. We have that idea and they should be able to decide from their own what they want to be. So we have this constant argument that's going back and forth, and that's really what's surrounding land acquisition. Even, you could even point to the Mexican-American War and how there's a large territory that's established that is brought into the fold of the United States. You have the future states of Arizona, New Mexico, you have California, right? You have Texas as part of that as well. And even then, it's kind of a land grab by James K. Polk, who wants to eventually get to the point where we're expanding this southern territory that can be used to continue human bondage. So we do have that as an emphasis for all the presidents that have been leading up to Ulysses S. Grant. This is the first time we're not really talking about that anymore. So it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, should we expand? Should we not? I don't know. That's an interesting piece that I wanted to just kind of point out with this address. But of course, we have the efforts of the executive branch to make sure that, once again, everyone is continuing to be equal. We want everybody to have the same rights. It's interesting. He talks about the Native Americans, and he wants to try to have a peaceful resolution there. Right? He points out that wars are expensive. Even if we're going to go to war against these individuals, it's going to cost money, and we don't want to have any more costs in terms of money going toward a war effort. And certainly, finances are going to be at the forefront of his mind. Right? We've mentioned that before, how there needs to be a reevaluation of the economics of America, and this is all part of bringing the country back into the fold once the war has concluded. Reconstruction efforts would start to take a hit in the latter stages of Grant's presidency. For one thing, there was a disenchantment for Grant as a whole, with several scandals and signs of corruption within his administration. Bribes would run pretty rampant, even amongst higher levels of government, Belknap being involved in one event in 1876. There was also a breach of treaty with the Lakotas, which sounds like a good subject for a future episode. Additionally, as more Southern Democrats came back into the political fold, so too would the zeal for continued efforts die down. Voting rights would again be infringed upon in the South for African Americans, with troops being pulled out. Other paramilitary groups would arise, even with the effective tactics initially against the KKK, including the White Leagues and the Red Shirts, who would ensure that Democrats took home election victories as opposed to Republicans. Grant and his administration would become less and less likely to enforce Reconstruction by force, which unfortunately would allow for continued anti-black sentiment to grow. Many of the Republican governments were gone. Poor whites would be turned to continue their status quo before the war. This will lead to the future Jim Crow laws in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This new group of governments will become to be known as Redeemer governments, originally set up to protect the rights, but would slowly strip the rights of African Americans once again. With this, we can link up the lost cause and the fact that former Confederates would continue to not be remorseful of their rebellion. The Republican Party would continue to split between radicals and non-radicals. Rutherford B. Hayes would win the 1876 election. Hayes would take a narrow electoral vote over Democrat from New York, Samuel Tilden, 185 to 184. Tilden would actually win the popular vote. This election will be marred with suppression of the black vote, especially in southern states. Officially, the period of Reconstruction is usually defined as ending in 1877, though. We might need to continue to take a look post-1877 in a future episode, though, as we will obviously have continued fallout from the Civil War, and of course, we have Reconstruction as well moving forward. The history of the United States moving to 1900 will be an interesting look to continue to wrap up the Civil War. Overall, though, I think it's unfortunate. You get the idea that in this Reconstruction period, especially in Grant's presidency, it's just kind of like, even though we had all those great things in his second inaugural address, it's kind of like, all right, well, let's just get things back going, let's fire it back up. And then, unfortunately, as the administration kind of loses its legitimacy in the eyes of the public, again, with all these scandals, then you have people who are less gung-ho about continuing to execute this, right? There's a little bit of a movement for there to be some Republicans in the South, but, there's just not anything to make it continue, right? There's not anything that's going to keep kind of swinging the pendulum, especially when it's like, all right, let's get the economy, let's get money back the way it should be, and then, hey, we'll call it a day right there. So you kind of get that idea, and it's one of those things that I think is unfortunate. And also, what are you supposed to do, right? I don't really know exactly what the correct answer is for either of these things, right? So it is just kind of an interesting look. It's an interesting period in American history, and probably, again, I kind of breezed through. You probably have an entire podcast about Reconstruction, and I said that when I talked about the beginning of the Civil War, and you could probably have a whole bunch of different episodes talking about different things with that, and so it could be something that we go and revisit in a later date. But with that, let's go ahead and call it a day right there. We had our part 2 of Reconstruction. Hopefully we have at least a pretty good idea of a rundown of events in terms of how Reconstruction kind of pans out here. Specifically in this episode, we covered mostly the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. But now that we have our second Reconstruction episode under the belt, where exactly are we going to go from here? Well, one of the ideas that we have for continuing our episodes, and we will start on next week, is that we will have our general analysis. We will go ahead and start, and I don't really think there's any better place to start than Robert E. Lee. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.